College campuses, those enduring locations where people go to learn about science, technology, engineering, medicine, and of course, history. It was on one of these installations that a young Lucius Aurelian was attempting to teach history. We were looking at the age of the robber barons, the Gilded Age, and then the Progressive Era. But there were some confusing contradictions, so I went and talked to my department chair. He reassured me there were no problems, and he said these were poor, hungry people with real problems, and their leaders needed to help them. Suffice to say, I didn't get any answer to my question or concerns. Today we're going to explore the real account of the robber barons, or the reset barons. The Gilded Age was quite intriguing, as is the era of the robber barons, where we understand that there were many individuals who have different reputations and different names. What exactly is a robber baron, and where is the name derived from? Why do these individuals have such mixed reputations, and what role do they play in our history, in our true history? We've long had many concepts of political corruption in America, or the United States, depending on what you want to call it today. And in these particular concepts of corruption, it's either been local officials or politicians at the highest level who have perhaps, how shall we say, been susceptible to certain influences of corruption. But what about the 1800s and the Gilded Age era? How was it the United States was able to go so rapidly from a new nation with very rural agrarian roots into this incredible industrialized powerhouse that in fact was a world power at the beginning of the 20th century or the early 1900s? And what exactly led to it becoming a world power? Well, we look at this development, this rapid urbanization of the United States, a compilation of many different peoples. And we have these robber barons, and who exactly is this individual? And I'm asking this question openly. Do we know exactly who these people are in these pictures, or do we just assume that we know? What if someone made a mistake at some point in time? Well, it's just something to think about, and I wanted to run this by you. Now let's look at Andrew Carnegie, industrialist and philanthropist, 1835 to 1919, the individual who started the Great Steel Empire. And we're well aware that Andrew Carnegie is never referred to as a robber baron. He's oftentimes referred to as a philanthropist, an individual who built a great empire, a captain of industry, a hero if you will. And we're well aware of his steel empire. Why wasn't he assigned the term robber baron, or as I say in this exploration, reset baron? Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that he did really embrace philanthropy, although it should be noted that he has that interesting dual reputation. He was a captain of industry and a leader in the philanthropist age. Cornelius Vanderbilt, 1794 to 1877, the business magnate, the railroad man, and the original American robber baron. And why exactly did he get the term robber baron? The term is derived from feudal lords in Germany who exacted tolls on bridges and roads, and it was said to be unfair tolls. They were corrupt and they bent the law. Of course, we've looked at the account of J.P. Morgan, and you can certainly see his name all over the place, and in fact, the J.P. Morgan Bank offers the best interest rates in many respects when it comes to savings accounts and certificates of deposit, even to this day. He was one of the great financial leaders. And then, of course, we have the massive John Jacob Astor family, a family with many different generations. But why would we consider these individuals robber barons? Well, were they really robber barons? Or did they have some other reputation that was actually associated with them? We have this mixed historical view of these individuals because we see them as being both the leaders and captains of American industry with the so-called Second Industrial Revolution, which in the official history came after the American Civil War, and they're the individuals that really brought the United States into the quote-unquote modern age. I suppose you could say it's the same mixed reputation that Stalin has with his 5-year plans and how he brought the Soviet Union into the modern industrial age. Yet we look at the humble origins of the Astor family and we see how well that they lived in the past with incredible mansions and castles and other wondrous structures. Their wealth developed throughout the 1800s of the 19th century when everything else happened. We're most familiar, though, with John Jacob Astor IV, an individual who, according to official history, opposed the creation of a central bank. And, in fact, many of the political inclinations that the progressive era of the early 1900s was leaning towards. However, we know what became of John Jacob Astor IV. Unfortunately, he perished during his crossing of the Atlantic in the fateful voyage on the Titanic. And here is an image of him in his later years. And if you did, in fact, see that film in 1997, which many people did, you'll recall that John Jacob Astor IV was portrayed by American German-born actor Eric Braeden, also known as Victor Newman, in the long-running soap opera Young and the Restless. Boy, this guy gets around. He shows up in everywhere. Escape from the Planet of the Apes, and of course in Colossus, the Forbidden Project. Unfortunately, most of his scenes were excised from Titanic, but James Cameron's a legendary director, apparently. So what's really the account with these robber barons, these captains of industry, or these philanthropists? Why do they have so many mixed reputations? Even contemporary accounts from the time frame show that these individuals have these mixed reputations. Some of them were simply great business leaders, according to the official history. And yet at other times they were very corrupt individuals. Cornelius Vanderbilt, for example, circumventing and going around local laws and apparently encouraging public officials to charge more for transportation fees, and therefore he was able to underbid transportation for the transportation of goods, and therefore making a very tidy profit. We also recall John D. Rockefeller, 1839 to 1937, businessman and philanthropist. And I don't think I need to even tell you what he was the head of, but in case you don't know, Standard Oil, the greatest oil empire the United States has ever known. An empire, a trust that had to be broken up. And yet he became a philanthropist. There's also Jay Koch. You may not be aware of him, a financier during the U.S. Civil War. Very, very interesting image with that intense look in his eyes, as many individuals from that time frame, well, they must have had because they were great business leaders. But how exactly do we reconcile the simultaneous rise of all these incredible business leaders and their wondrous achievements in the 1800s? Here's another interesting picture of Jay Koch, and this is apparently during the United States Civil War, and of course he has the look, with the wondrous beard included, and the nice hat picture. He's wearing a gray hat, it looks like in this image, but it should be noted he was a financier for the Union cause. And here's Koch Castle, one of his many houses that's very aptly named, I would say. What exactly is this particular house made out of? And so what am I doing in this exploration? We're really challenging the identity of who these individuals are, and we're only looking at a few. There are so many robber barons or reset barons that there's too many to name. But is the fact that they have a conflicted account already from contemporary records, in other words, some people were saying that these individuals were great revolutionary thinkers, that really they were responsible for ushering in the so-called Second Industrial Revolution in the United States. Without their business leadership, without their interests, there never would have been the development of the great railroad in the United States. And recall that was something that the United States, despite not inventing the railroad, official history says that it was originally started in England, or the United Kingdom at the time, the United States managed to surpass the United Kingdom in the development of the railroad. And they did this despite the fact that they had many different individuals from many different nations and many different customs speaking a wide variety of languages. And how was that achieved? Because they had these great industrial leaders, these captains of industry, these individuals whose reputations go on the spectrum of being robber barons who utilized unethical business practices to influence politicians. And yet simultaneously, they had the far-reaching goals. They had the ability, the drive, the ambition to really build this incredible American railroad empire out of nothing. And of course, it spread to other areas. It spread to steel, it spread to finance, and virtually every other thing that you can think of. Well, minus bricks, of course. We don't exactly know who the brick baron was from the 1800s. We have many different theories, but all we really have is that bricks were made in St. Louis after that nasty fire started by a steamship, and there's no reason to question that history. Indeed, many people who never witnessed the event will assure me that's what happened in the comments section, and by all means, what do you think happened? Let me know. But John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil, an individual whose reputation and the effects of his decisions went far past his lifetime. In fact, what we understand is that these so-called robber barons, in an effort to improve their reputations, became philanthropists, and we're well aware of where Rockefeller reached into certain areas. And you may recall that when we looked at Yerkes Observatory, that of course was from another financier, Mr. Charles Yerkes, and the endowment that he left, the University of Chicago, so they could build an incredible observatory in Wisconsin. It all makes total sense. But what exactly was the reputation of these robber barons? Well, they had a darker side to their reputation, that they forced labor, that they employed child labor. There were no labor laws in the United States, and at that time it was stated that people just had to work very, very hard, to include the children. And that's what the official history says. They either worked or they faced no ability to exist in this society, in this civilization. Even though we understand that the U.S. Constitution was originally established well before the 1800s, it was, of course, modified, which we've looked at, by President Lincoln during the United States Civil War, but the base tenets of it were supposed to be the same. And here we have Henry Flagler, and you might remember he was the other great robber baron or philanthropist, depending on how you want to look at it. Oligarch or philanthropist, that's the modern term for it, who built up the incredible numerous castles, hotels, that are in Florida to this day. And you might recall we explored his exploits in the St. Augustine exploration. So what was the real story, though, with these robber barons, these reset barons? Were these really business-minded individuals from humble origins, or did they have a completely different account? Could it have been possible that these were individuals that were, how shall we say, selected, that were known to facilitate this period of transition? A period of transition that followed what we may think of as a complete civilization reset. Now, how do you want to view that? Do you view that as the official history, that the reset was really more of a revolution? It was a change in technology, and the people had to be dragged into this new world, kicking and screaming, oftentimes against their will. And if you didn't have these incredible captains of industry, these robber barons or these reset barons, this never would have happened. Or could it be possible that these were the individuals that were the real leaders who were brought about to facilitate the final phase, if you will, of the last reset? To bring about a new civilization, a new society, a new order. They had the means and the resources to do it. And most importantly, they had the knowledge. Because whether you accept the mainstream official historical account, or if you believe there's an alternative account, no one argues the fact that these reset barons, or these robber barons, or these philanthropists, or however we decide to view them, were responsible for actually bringing the United States through the Second Industrial Revolution. And we've certainly explored that in our numerous looks at technological and industrial revolutions, especially with the United States. The reason the United States being so interesting is because it was really built up from nothing. It had an incredible population growth of over 1,000% from 1800 to 1900. That's what the official numbers say. And to say nothing about the details that went into the construction of the numerous railroads, the establishment of vast heavy industry, all happening very quickly in a short amount of time. Even more impressive was the destructive nature of the United States Civil War in the 1860s and the vast loss of life and the destruction of property that was associated with it. Yet despite the devastation of the U.S. Civil War, the United States officially recovered very quickly. The former Confederate States of America, reintegrated in the United States of America at the end of the Civil War, quickly rebuilt its shattered cities, and the great industry expanded across the entire nation. Again, that's what the official history will say. But is that exactly what really happened? Is that what we're really looking at when it comes to this account of these incredible Gilded Age mansions, houses, castles, palaces, whatever we want to call them? It's certain to say that we don't build structures like this today, and we have our usual slew of reasons why we don't. It's prohibitively expensive. Yes, we actually have the temerity to say and believe that things are prohibitively expensive when we spend $1 trillion as a nation assisting other nations in conflicts, and we also shut down our entire economy for over a year just 5 short years ago. Now, there were also a lot of issues with labor relations, and there was entire social breakdowns over labor disputes that occurred during the latter portion of the 1800s. There were attempts to formulate large labor movements, advocating for things such as the 8-hour workday. And perhaps you could say this favors the argument of what was happening at the time. Why would anybody accept child labor? Why would anybody accept working more than 8 hours a day or 12-hour days? And yet it was during this Gilded Age period, the tail end of this period of robber barons, that the very first skyscraper was constructed in Chicago. Sorry, New York City. Again, at least that's what the official history says. Although it seems as though there's many questionable accounts of that, because How is it that we were in a civilization that was building skyscrapers, while at the same time, apparently the vast majority of the population was living in sod houses? And again, the explanation will be because they were on the frontier, of course. So, a nation that was expanding, where was its real center of gravity? Where was its true focus? Was it in the cities? Was it on the frontier? Was it really possible to do these diverging centers of gravity at the same time? Keep in mind, this was a fledgling nation. I've always found it very, very intriguing and just completely amazing that the United States, and even during its brief existence, the Confederate States of America, were able to field and equip large national armies. They were also able to pull off other amazing things. Ah yes, P.J. Kennedy, another great business leader from the 1800s. You may be aware of his grandson, John F. Kennedy, or his other grandson, Robert F. Kennedy, and we've explored the tragic legacy of his granddaughter, Rosemary Kennedy. So the business leadership, the very interesting society and civilization that came about in the 1800s. The interesting education of the native population and their integration into the new nation. The complete identity of the United States that involved everybody. Remember that these were different peoples. We had different ethnic groups, people from all over Europe, the Native Americans, and others. Terence V. Powderly, the Grand Master Workman of the Knights of Labor, and a name and a title that just rolls right off the tongue, he was one of the individuals that tried to organize labor and really bring about vast changes. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be, at least in the 1800s, and eventually his movement collapsed. And so there it was, at the end of the 1800s, the vast monopolies, the incredible works of the captains of industry. Yet they changed their reputation with the following era, what we call the Progressive Era. And yet it's interesting to note that while it seems as though the United States as a nation was built during the Gilded Age, or the Age of the Robber Baron, with the rise of natural gas and oil, and the vast fields of oil derricks everywhere across the nation, it's interesting to note, though, that their reputation was solidified during the early 1900s with the Progressive Era that followed the Gilded Age. But what exactly was the true account of what happened? If you ever go back and watch a film, The Age of Innocence, with Daniel Day-Lewis, and not that I'm going to say anything about the present film that Daniel Day-Lewis is in, you'll get an idea of the kind of society at that time. And it's very intriguing trying to reconcile the reality, the existence of that particular society with what its achievements were, because we tend to see what happened with the wondrous construction of cities, while at the same time people were still living in sod houses. But what about these robber barons? Do we have any people who act like modern robber barons? Well, it's interesting to note that the creator of Star Trek, the original series, actually wrote lyrics for the original title of Star Trek. Yes, a lot of people aren't aware that there were lyrics that were never meant to be used, written all for the point of giving Gene Roddenberry 50% of the royalties, which cut composer Alexander Courage's cut in half. And you may also recall, going back to Gene Roddenberry enacting some robber baron-like tendencies, he tried to use the last episode of the second season of the original series of Star Trek to shoehorn in another series, an episode called Assignment Earth. I guess the best thing I can say about it is that it gave Terry Garr's career a start. And then, of course, there's Bruce Springsteen, rock legend, and an individual who's definitely a man of the people, and sings songs to ensure that he's looking out for the people. And you would certainly think that an individual who's dedicated his entire rock life to looking out for the common working people of America and ultimately the world, you might be surprised to know that he's also in a controversial state and acting with robber baron tendencies for charging some, how shall we say, exorbitant prices for his tickets. Well, the justification for doing this is simply because other artists are charging high amounts. This is around 2023, so why shouldn't he? And thus we have robber baron tendencies. So what changed? How did we go from a gilded age of robber barons to a progressive era where we went away from this incredible and intense labor focus for the entire civilization? From 1890 onward, we entered a period called the Progressive Era. But how did it happen? We understand the official history tells us that there were a lot of efforts to curtail this incredible focus of labor, people working vast days and working until they dropped, and then of course child labor. Although from an objective perspective, how exactly does child labor make any sense, because children certainly could never work the hours that adults did. But as we understand it, it was simply the matter of taking advantage of labor in any way that they could. And there was also the fact that women were disenfranchised from voting in the United States. And so with these labor relations, the disenfranchisement of women and others from voting, there were a lot of grievances that needed to be addressed. And there apparently were attempts that were going on in the late 1800s. There was also another peculiar development with the United States, the sudden mentality to become a world power and annex other territories. Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. Now, of course, we can look earlier in the United States history and we can see that they annexed portions of what used to be Mexico as part of Manifest Destiny, and we've already talked about the Native Americans and the unfortunate history with that. However, we see that there was a focus, though, on the United States suddenly being a world power because it challenged other world powers in the late 1890s with the so-called Spanish-American War, and then the United States occupation and insurgency in the Philippines, as it was officially called. Yet while all this was going on, this progressive era and the politicians, and I say politicians because it was not one political party that defined itself as progressive, wanted to bring about some vast changes to society. It was progressive. And that was, of course, giving women the right to vote. And the efforts, give women a square deal. Everybody got a deal in the 1900s, a square deal, a fair deal, a new deal. Bust the deal, face the wheel. But what was it all really focused on? We've looked at history and we've noticed there's been quite a different series of accounts of women playing critical roles. And even though they didn't officially have the right to vote, we understand that women were in key roles as librarians, preserving knowledge. This is Ida Minerva Tarbell, a leading muckraker, progressive-minded journalist, 1857 to 1944. And a muckraker, a legitimate journalist who was questioning the efforts of these robber barons. And of course, Ida Minerva Tarbell, and I'm not making up her middle name, we know what Minerva was referring to. She came from a family in Pennsylvania that had initially started their own oil business. And of course, they had run afoul of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil and had experienced some grievances in the way that they did business. And as a result of that, and I'm not making this up, Ida Tarbell's family, her father was actually in Iowa trying to start a settlement. He had to come back. But she wrote several books looking at the account of the Standard Oil Company. And you might also notice she was author of The Life of Abraham Lincoln and The Life of Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, two individuals that are very historically similar. Well, no, officially they're not, I'm being facetious, but very interesting that all the accounts that we have of Abraham Lincoln's early life were from the efforts of Ida M. Tarbell researching it, to include his log cabin days, apparently. And she really pulled apart the works of Rockefeller and really exposed the business practices of Standard Oil to the vast population with her writings. She put a lot of effort into what she was doing, and another interesting note is that she wasn't exactly considered the best student, but was very intelligent. As a result of the demands on her writing, she spent a lot of time here in this Clifton Springs sanatorium in New York. Sanatorium, asylum, is it the same thing? Well, apparently she could come and go as she pleased. But this era of this open-minded, muckraking journalist, the predecessor, if you will, to Geraldo Rivera, is what brought about the progressive era, according to official history. The main initial goal was to give women the right to vote and really end this period of disenfranchisement across the nation. After all, the Civil War was fought to end slavery, and eventually it had given African Americans the right to vote officially. But who were these progressive era politicians? Would you be surprised to know that they included both hardcore Democrats and Republicans? It even officially included socialists and other interesting leaders. So what exactly was the progressive era all about? Did it really represent a time of bipartisan cooperation in the United States? We have all these efforts of women suffragists marching for the right to vote and images that document it historically, this image being from Boone, Iowa. Very intriguing that the town was so well built up in the early 1900s with some incredible structures. But what effort did it take? I always remember this interesting relief I saw in the Iowa State Capitol. these women depicted in this image never exactly looked like women that were looking to achieve any sort of rights or required any sort of rights. They looked like they already had full rights and understanding within a society. That's just my interpretation, and perhaps it's some idealized image. This is Carrie Chapman Catt, one of the foremost women's suffragist leaders and a political leader who was very active in the early 1900s and a critical leader to give women the right to vote. She had moved to Iowa when she was very young and actually attended Iowa State University, or Iowa Agricultural College as it was known during that time. And she made the very controversial move of having women suffragists embrace World War I and embodying the patriotic fervor. This was something that apparently had the entire nation see the suffragists as patriots, and of course won favor across the nation. And it should be noted that at the conclusion of World War I, women were granted the right to vote, the main stated goal of the Progressive Era. Although there are some other interesting images, and here at the Old Main at the Iowa Agricultural College, we see what looks to be a formation of female soldiers. How very intriguing. We've looked at this image before, and I'm not exactly sure how to explain it. I always found it rather curious, though, that during the United States Civil War, you think Abraham Lincoln would have been all about having a women's Army Corps that was subsequently fielded in World War II. I mean, why not? Winning the Civil War was a critical factor. This is Catt Hall, at least the old building at Iowa State that has endured to this day. Very interesting imagery and landscape, again back when it was Iowa Agricultural College, or the Iowa Model Farm as it was really originally known as. How interesting that all these connections to Iowa always come into these explorations, and I certainly don't plan this. And here we have Catt Hall today, where the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences is located at Iowa State University, fitting in quite a way, and named after Carrie Chapman Catt. And then, of course, we have this other mechanics lab, or lab of mechanics, or whatever you want to call it, from Iowa State. I'm simply looking at this image because it's rather intriguing, some of these early images that we have of this Iowa Agricultural College that would become Iowa State University. It's also interesting to note all of its rather mainstream connections that we have to official history. The Adanazoff-Berry computer being invented at Iowa State, leading to the creation of the Colossus computer during World War II. The other interesting advents to include women's suffragist leader Carrie Chapman Catt graduating from Iowa State, or Iowa Agricultural College, and leading about to her vast rise in politics. And so this is what the Progressive Era was all about, providing freedom and rights, and being able to facilitate the nation, and breaking the rule of the robber barons, or the industrialists and all their terrifying trusts. And so they needed leaders. And who would the nation turn to? Well, you turn to those very same leaders. Yes, Andrew Carnegie, the individual who you could have considered a robber baron himself, although he's not remembered as a robber baron. He is considered one of the foremost leaders of the Progressive Era. And we're well aware of all the endowments that Mr. Carnegie had with the Carnegie libraries and thousands, literally thousands of buildings that are attributed to him. This is Robert M. La Follette, and make sure you emphasize that La Follette quite uniquely. He was a Republican politician who was also a progressive leader in the great state of Wisconsin. And maybe the main reason I highlight him is that he bears a rather striking resemblance, especially with the hair, to director David Lynch. Maybe this is just rather a coincidence. Although I have to say the facial features don't exactly look like David Lynch, but perhaps as Robert La Follette did engage in transcendental meditation. Or maybe it would be more appropriate to say that he actually bore a more striking resemblance to a combination of David Lynch and David Lynch's well-known acting collaborator, Jack Nance, who appeared in his original film Eraserhead, and that film is quite a trip. So maybe if you combine the facial features of Jack Nance with the hair of David Lynch, then you have Robert M. La Follette. And very interesting that a progressive leader would be against alcohol. And here we have Eugene Debs. Yes, the great socialist leader. A socialist was actually considered a leader in the Progressive Era. Don't you find that fascinating? And I think that's the most interesting detail about the Progressive Era. Even though we've always had our great political divide in the United States between the Republicans and the Democrats, the official Progressive Era started really with William McKinley. the president who met a very unfortunate end at the World's Fair in Buffalo. And yet a lot of his policies, the initial conduct of the Spanish-American War, the annexation of Cuba, the eventual establishment of the United States as a world power, started under his administration. But yet William Jennings Bryan, the primary Democratic challenger for president, even though he never actually won the presidency, was also considered a progressive era leader. So on opposite ends of the party. And you can certainly see how he plays a good role in history. But what about other political leaders? President Taft. And I always remember that story about President Taft going down to that very interesting meeting that he had in Mexico, in Juarez. And you can actually hear a telling of that story if you watch the film Sicario. But yet, despite the fact that he was a Republican, he was also considered a member of the progressive era. And then there's Teddy Roosevelt, the individual who started off as a Republican, but then started his own political party, the Progressive Party. And granted, he did not win the presidency after starting his own party, but he did enable a Democrat to finally take office in the United States as president, that being Woodrow Wilson. And that's what the official history says. A little interesting note about Woodrow Wilson, he was actually a citizen of the Confederate States of America, although he was a child when the Civil War happened. And he was a Democrat, yet he was also considered a progressive era leader. And he brought in a lot of these sweeping changes. Here's his residency when he was at Princeton. What a very lovely structure that it is. But how did all this happen? What was really the goal of the progressive era? Well, we understand the goal was to provide women the vote, to achieve the universal suffrage that was sought after. Another interesting historical note, though, is that Herbert Hoover, a Republican, was also considered a member of the progressive era leadership. Yes, very, very interesting. Now you can see why I had so many questions for my department chair back in the day. There were things that just didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me, but maybe I was asking too many questions. Another little detail is the establishment of the Commission on Training Camp Activities, a progressive era doctrine. And this came about when the United States was fielding its first true national army to fight in World War I, and it talks about health and why health is so important. Health is even more important than military training. Training is useless without health. And these series of programs also brought about, how shall we say, the socialization of the American soldier in World War I. It also went about establishing that national identity that all individuals took with them when they finished their military service. How intriguing that there wasn't an account of this during the United States Civil War. Well, of course there wasn't. They were volunteer militia units. There was also the interesting establishment of the treatment of juveniles. Here from this particular individual in the great city of Denver, which we've looked at before, the Honorable Ben B. Lindsay, and he's credited with being the father of juvenile court. And so a very strange occurrence, a series of details with the passage of these three critical amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the goals of the progressives. And here we have the thing that they considered most important because they passed it first. Article 16, Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes. The United States federal income tax. And how did the United States accept this initially? Well, you can see that at that time, unless you made $20,000 or about $600,000 a year, you were only paying 1% taxes on your income. And so you can see how that would be a lot more acceptable to the people at that time. Now you're probably asking the question, well, why don't we still pay 1% income tax? The answer is that during World War II, the United States was caught by surprise at Pearl Harbor. There was a surprise attack by the Japanese, and the United States, despite its best efforts to avoid getting involved in World War II, they were suddenly dragged into it. And Germany also declared war on the United States after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese also managed to surprise the United States Far Eastern Air Force in the Philippines 10 hours later after the attack on Pearl Harbor due to a series of controversial events, although there's never been any definitive conclusion how the Far East Air Force was caught by surprise in the Philippines 10 hours later. But whatever, the fact that the United States military was in a very defensive posture in the Pacific conflict that had been drawn into by the surprise attack from the Japanese. Of course, it should be noted that the Japanese were unable to surprise the Soviet Union. In the battles of Khalkhin Gol, the Soviet Union had sent their best commander Zhukov and armor mech divisions to utterly destroy the Japanese army, or at least defeat it quite badly. However, the United States was caught by surprise numerous times, and nobody could possibly see a war coming, although fortunately the United States was able to convert from a pre-war economy to an industrialized war economy. And in effect, it also established a program of taxation. It expanded taxation. And you can see here with the real GDP growth, the black line, and then the gray shaded area being the amount of taxation collected during World War II. 4 million registered taxpayers went up to 40 million during the 1940s and World War II. And thus this brought about the construction of the great American military machine to win World War II. And that is the story of how the United States accepted income tax rates. And we'll see exactly what that culminated into this day. But I always found it very interesting that all these incredible things that were built, the ships, the planes, the tanks, the infinite amounts of rifles and machine guns to bring about a successful conclusion to World War II, that by the end of the war, the United States had so much equipment that they ended up throwing it into the ocean in many places because, well, it was cheaper than bringing it back to the nation and preserving it for future conflicts. That's an interesting history. And of course, today you'll see that federal income taxes now are 10% for anybody making under $11,601 today. And once you're over that, you're getting taxed 12%. And of course, we can read into the history of how that happened and understand that it was all a very legal process. Yet going back to when the Progressive Era brought this all about, the political cartoons, and I'd never seen this one before, showing Woodrow Wilson as a pharaoh figure, if you will, that was really dragging the entire nation along with these Progressive Era changes. And it was during the Progressive Era and the administration of Woodrow Wilson that the amendment, the 16th Amendment, was passed. Subsequently, there was also the passage of the 18th Amendment, where prohibition, or the restriction on the use of alcohol anywhere in the United States, was passed. Yes, you'll notice that the state of Wisconsin resisted it. I guess Robert La Follette didn't have that kind of pull. And here we have it. The amendment itself. Another amendment to the Constitution. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof or exportation in the United States subject to jurisdiction. Yes. And then finally, as almost as though it was the least priority of the amendments, they passed the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And so interesting how this chronological unfolding of these amendments to the great United States Constitution brought about our current modern era. Some people view this as a rather overreaction to the statements and actions of these robber barons. And yet, half of these robber barons or more became designated philanthropists who supported this progressive era. So what do you think really happened? Was this all just natural history? Or is there a deeper story in this, especially with these leaders, these individuals that we call both robber barons and philanthropists?
You were sleeping. You slept too long. We will have. It's time we woke. Time we stopped running.
Good evening, Prime Explorers, and thank you for joining me. And I know you've been eagerly anticipating this one, the story of Carnegie and the Codices. And this does follow up on the earlier Prime Explorer video, Academic Dishonesty. So if you haven't gotten the chance to see that one, I strongly suggest you watch it because it gives you some baseline for how I came to these conclusions. The first Carnegie Library opens in America. We've always talked about the Carnegie Libraries and what was the official mainstream account on it. March 18th, 1889. On March 18th, 1889, the Carnegie Free Library of Braddock opened in a suburb of Pittsburgh. Isn't that interesting? The city that just happens to have the Cathedral of Learning. It was the first library donated by businessman and philanthropist Andrew Carnegie in America. From 1886 to 1919, Carnegie donated more than $40 million to open 1,679 libraries. Some sources say it was as many as 4,000. There's a lot of conflicting accounts in terms of how many libraries actually opened from the Carnegie grants. Because remember, he just provided the money. It was ultimately up to the local municipalities, whether that was a city, a town, a county, to actually open the libraries across the country. He also built additional libraries around the world. because providing money to open libraries in the United States wasn't enough. He was just that good of a guy, especially when you read about his biography. These libraries were in communities both small and large and opened up a world of learning, entertainment, and possibility to millions of patrons. Carnegie was a Scottish-American immigrant who made his fortune in the railroad and steel industries. He also was quite the employer of the Pinkertons, but more on that another time. Before the end of his life, he donated nearly 90% of his fortune, $350 million, to various causes. What a nice guy. During the second half of the 19th century, the idea of free libraries began to spread. Don't you like that? Free, in quotations. Carnegie, who was born in Scotland in 1835, immigrated to America as a boy after industrialization forced his father out of the textile business. Wait a minute, what? We actually have the Industrial Revolution being accounted for doing something bad and forcing someone out of their job? Say it isn't so. The Carnegie family settled in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, where young Andrew got a job as a messenger boy. There he met Colonel James Anderson. Each Saturday, Anderson opened his personal library and allowed young workers like Carnegie to borrow books. Again, another altruistic benefactor. The books opened up a new world for Andrew, who vowed that if he ever became wealthy, he would provide this generosity to others. Carnegie spent the next 50 years building his fortune, though occasionally his methods were scrutinized. I can't imagine why. He faced criticism in 1892 when workers at his Homestead steel mill decided to strike over low wages and better working conditions. The strike spiraled into a violent gun battle requiring a militia to restore peace. Again, another instance of violence when we supposedly didn't have instances of violence in the United States, but I digress. One editorial complained 10,000 Carnegie public libraries would not compensate for the evils resulting from the Homestead lockout. Some argued that Carnegie built his fortune on the backs of poor workers. Carnegie, however, believed that a library was one way that workers could improve themselves. He wanted libraries housed in beautiful buildings with big windows and ample light. This was a change for many towns that housed makeshift libraries in churches, stables, or at the back of shops. Ooh. Carnegie devised a plan to award grants for library construction for communities in need. Grants were conditional upon 3 conditions. First, municipalities had to own the property where the library would be built. Second, the property had to be large enough for future expansion if demand arose. And third, grant recipients had to pay 10% of the gift for building maintenance. Don't you find that intriguing? Initially, when an application was approved, a community could build any type of building they wanted. That's what they're telling us. Keep that in mind. Carnegie felt some of the buildings were not an efficient use of space and later insisted on approving plans before construction began. That's right. The guy who was the benefactor and the altruist that was involved in this insisted on approving the plans for over 1,000, again some say 4,000 libraries, because apparently he just had oodles of time on his hands, right? In fact, he had so much time on his hands, he even wrote a book, Notes on Library Building, and sent it to each community that received a grant. The standards outlined in the book meant that many Carnegie libraries looked similar. Oh, there's the explanation. But do they look similar? Well, keep that in mind. They had high ceilings and spacious interiors. The exterior was often stone or brick, or something even more advanced, but the high ceilings meant that access to the library from street level usually included a flight of stairs, a very elaborate flight of stairs, I might add. These stairs became a hallmark of Carnegie libraries, and just about every other old world building, and some claim they represented climbing towards wisdom or working towards knowledge. The stairs, however, proved a hindrance to older or disabled patrons. Yes, back before our all access that were required in buildings. And here you have the type of Carnegie libraries in Iowa, and you can see that there are many different types. I mean, here we have the classic pediment and the columns. Here we have a different style. Here another style, and here another style, and yet all very clearly old world buildings. This is a picture taken in 1917 in Iowa. Ah yes, Iowa comes up again. Look, I don't make this up. There's a reason why Iowa is at the center of our explorations, and it's not just because of the Iowa State Capitol in Des Moines. By the time Carnegie issued the last library grant in 1919, most states had at least one Carnegie library, while other states had many. California had 142. You'll never guess which state actually had the most. Hint, it wasn't Iowa this time, and it wasn't California. Some Carnegie libraries are still in use today. Others are no longer standing or have been converted into civic centers or commercial businesses, because they're very well-constructed buildings, and why wouldn't you still want to use buildings like that? It's also intriguing to note that very few Carnegie libraries have actually been torn down. And then, of course, they asked if you have a Carnegie library in your community. Well, I'll ask that question to you, Prime Explorers. Do you have a Carnegie Library in your community? If you do, you might have quite the opportunity for your own explorations. Now let's move on. And if you look up Carnegie Library just doing a Google image search, you will find no shortage of wondrous and elaborate old world buildings. You'll also notice that virtually no two of them look the same. In fact, there doesn't seem to be any similar style whatsoever, contrary to Carnegie writing a book and contrary to what was claimed in the article. And you notice that even in Iowa, we have 4 very divergent styles of libraries, and when you look at all these styles of libraries, you'll see that these are wondrous old world buildings, and yet we've got domes, we've got pediments, we've got columns, and we have every other construction style, what we would call Second Empire Renaissance. Again, a mishmash of styles. But recall that this was from the 1890s until right before 1920. That's what the official story tells us. Now, I want you to step back a little bit and recall what I shared with you in academic dishonesty. Recall that there were accounts of a library that existed on a university. Because remember, we have to step back and recall that there are multiple forms of institutions that are working towards the same end. Now, of course, they will assure us that they're working towards different ends. The military institution is working towards the military end. The business institution is working towards the business end and generating capital. And depending on what nation you're in, your government's saying it's working on this or it's working on that. But you can actually find a lot of evidence, especially in this time frame, that multiple sectors, institutions, agencies, however you want to refer to them as bureaus, as they tended to call government agencies in the United States back in the early 1900s, were ultimately working towards the same end. And now, open your minds as we go to this next part here. 10 books and texts that are actually impossible to read. Now, you might recall that on the channel we did an exploration concerning the Voynich manuscript. The Voynich manuscript is the most well-known book that cannot be read, or deciphered, or decoded. But would you be surprised to know that there are other examples of books that cannot be read, or as they say, decoded, and hence the term when they say codex, almost as though it's in the terminology. There are other examples of other books that are written in languages or in some sort of code, as they try to state it, that cannot be read. And what kind of wisdom is actually in these books? Well, in this particular article, they refer to a couple books, some ciphers, some scrolls that have different examples of elements that can't be read, or wording, language, symbols, whatever you want to call it, because they call it everything in this article, and where these books are and where they're located. Now, of course, according to the article, they want you to think that this is a very rare phenomenon. And it's easy to explain maybe 9, 10 books across the entire world that can't be read. You know, somebody just had a lot of time on their hands and they decided to write the book in code. Well, I want to highlight this particular work right here, James Hampton's St. James, the Book of the Seven Dispensation. Now, you can see it just looks like a regular book that's hand-jammed in notes. But let's read the account from this, and it's actually a pretty decent summary. After janitor James Hampton died in 1964, the landlord of his rented garage discovered a huge religious sculpture, along with a notebook written in an unknown language. The art piece, known as the Throne of the Third Heaven of the nation's Millennium General Assembly, yes, that's what it says, Throne of the Third Heaven of the nation's Millennium General Assembly, was inspired by visions that Hampton received at Christ's second coming. He created it from scavenged materials over 14 years. The found objects, which include cardboard light bulbs and jars, are covered in shiny metallic foil and are arranged to form a grand altar with a throne at the center. It now resides at the Smithsonian and has been hailed as America's greatest work of visionary art. Yes, how much more of a clue do you need on this? Now let's go further. The notebook, titled St. James, the Book of the Seven Dispensation, remains a mystery. Professor Mark Stamp of San Jose State University and one of his students, Ethan Lay, attempted to decipher the text, known as Hamptonese. Yes, because we have no idea what language it's in, so, name it after that guy. To no avail. They scanned pages of the book and made them available online. Other than a few English words like revelation, which appears at the bottom of each page, which, if you had a revelation when you're actually looking at something, regardless of what kind of revelation it is, you might be writing it on there. The notebook is filled with what seems like an eclectic mixture of random scribbles. But after transcribing the writing so that it could be put into a computer, Stamp and Lay discovered that there was a definite pattern. Of course, there's a very real possibility that in spite of its language-like appearance, Hamptonese is simply the written equivalent of speaking in tongues, they explain in a 2005 paper. If so, then Hampton's notes may still be impossible to read, even if his language is eventually deciphered. So yes, they go so far as to state that what happened here was merely the result of someone who decided to scribble in an entire notebook. And you can kind of see it here with the revelation. Now, this is certainly worthy of its own exploration, and if I get multiple requests, I will look into this and trying to find this heaven of the nation's Millennium General Assembly, or throne of the third heaven of the nation's Millennium General Assembly. Just rolls right off the tongue. And isn't that just the kind of terminology you would expect someone who just had a religious revelation to state? Or does it sound like someone's referring to something else a little bit? It's very intriguing. And that ends this particular article. They give a couple other examples of codexes or codices and other books that they can't decipher. But what I want to share with you is, would you be surprised to know that there are multiple accounts of not hundreds, not thousands, not tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of books that were in languages that no one could decipher? Now, I have only seen a few books that were actually in languages that people claim that they couldn't recognize or couldn't decipher. And every time it's the same explanation. Well, it's written in some sort of code. It's written in something that we can't understand. Can you imagine, though, how if you had the existence of books that seem to defy the traditional mentality for binding, for assembly, such as, I don't know, remember when we explored the Codex Gigas, the Devil's Bible, the book that was supposedly produced by a single monk in under a day, according to the legend, so he had to promise his soul to the devil so they wouldn't entomb him in a wall. You might remember that account. In any event, the actual binding and assembly of that book, while we can read the language ostensibly, it's very advanced. And the replication and the artistic beauty of that language, which experts state was indeed written by one person, or perhaps it was written by some means we don't fully understand, defies the explanation for producing such a book. Now, if you have thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of these books found in, how shall we say, the remnants of libraries in certain areas of the land, well, suddenly you've got a serious problem, because you've got a lot of incontrovertible evidence that nobody could ignore that there's something that's not true with what they're being told about the past. So what do you do about it? Well, you know what we do about it when we have artifacts that don't fit into what we're told. They go to that place that we just talked about. I'm not going to mention it. You know the one I'm talking about. But what do you do when you have a bunch of library books that are scattered across the land? Well, you've got to establish a repository where you collect all those books. And how do you do that? Well, you provide public funding for the areas where you suspect that there are many of these books, and you have reconnaissance or people on the ground who have told you, yes, there are many books in this particular county in Iowa. And you might notice that the state of Indiana received a lot of grants for the Carnegie libraries. And that's what this is. This is a map that shows you each county, town, municipality that officially received a Carnegie grant. Keep in mind that there are rumored to be hundreds or thousands that were not cataloged, because Carnegie was a very secretive individual, or whoever was representing Carnegie, if you follow me. In any event, when you read this note down here, he says he matches the Carnegie grants to city names in the census microdata, uses modern-day mapping, and then colors indicate the year that Carnegie agreed to the grant. There is no complete list of Carnegie library opening dates, but anecdotal evidence, which coincidentally is all we have, and this was an official research paper from one of my students that I recall, and I received his permission to share it with you just on this private or member video. But he did the legwork behind all this, and all we really have is anecdotal evidence that suggests that the vast majority of communities receiving a grant constructed their library within 4 years of the grant announcement. Can you imagine something like that happening today? So really what it points to is that once this was stated to happen, it happened very fast, and before you knew it, they had libraries all across the nation. Now, did they really build them? Or did they simply repurpose, redesignate existing structures? Well, I'll leave that to you, but I think we know what we have rather strong evidence towards. Of course, you can debate me. Maybe we did actually build these buildings. Indeed. However, when you look at where the efforts were really concentrated, there's a reason why I have such an interest in the Midwest. Now, you might notice that there's very little effort given towards what we call the New England states, the Eastern Seaboard, even the old Deep South. Texas, not so much. Most of the effort is focused in the Midwest United States, a little bit in the western states of the Rocky Mountain states, even some in Utah, oddly enough, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, several in Wyoming and Montana. But there's not a lot in Wyoming and Montana. And then, of course, the many mentioned California. Well, to answer your earlier question, it's actually Indiana that has the most Carnegie Library grants, at least officially recorded. And remember, what's in Indiana? Indianapolis, the rather interesting city we did an exploration on that has all the roads and all the old world roads that are circuited right into it. And it also has that giant obelisk at the middle, which we say is a soldier and sailor's monument. Very suspicious. And then, of course, you're well aware of my interest in Iowa and the possibility of there being old libraries in Iowa, one that I had a personal encounter with. Now, as I said earlier in the exploration from academic dishonesty, I suspect that they eliminated all of these books a long time ago, that there's really not any survivors anywhere, because that would have been their top priority. And if you collected all of these old world books, if you will, at these libraries, then what did you do? Well, you had to quickly destroy them. And even to this day, libraries, and this includes university libraries, and not just major universities, but also the technical colleges, the community colleges, any and every other school that somehow falls in the academic system, they all have the same charter. And these Carnegie libraries had the same charter as well. Collect all of these books because we opened a new library. Find all your books and bring it to the library, and we'll establish it in a catalog. And who is paying attention? Who is really caring? The answer is nobody. We have a new library where we didn't have a library anymore. And we need to be educated, and they're going to have books to help us educate all of our young people. And you might notice that it happens to be as you go further out west, this is where the population was, how shall we say, newer. At least that's what the official account goes. Now, if you look at this other nice little map that he compiled, this shows you the location of public libraries in the United States as of 1929. And then, of course, he's got it broken down by year of founding. So very useful information here. And you'll see that a lot of the libraries, most of these are in green, they're not shaded in red, and that means most of them were in the late 1800s. A few were in the early 1900s as you go out to the western states. Now, what's really going on here? This points to the fact that these libraries were quickly established, and they were established in areas where many of these, how shall we say, books that would not fit the narrative needed to be collected, and they needed to be disposed of. And this needed to happen very quickly. Because if people had too much time to realize what was going on or think about this, then suddenly there would actually be an account of what happened to all these books. Whereas if you just found yourself in an area, and let's just say you're building a house or you're occupying a house, and someone tells you a story, well, the house was always there. It was built by Old Man Dan and his wife Mildred, and they came from the United Kingdom in the 1830s, and they built this nice house here in western Iowa, and then they left for economic opportunities in Minnesota, and we don't know what happened to them. You can settle in this nice house. Well, what happened to them? What happened to all the materials in the house? Well, the county repossessed it, auctioned them off, and we, of course, took all their books, and we gave their books to the library. Now, if you repeat that story enough, people will say, well, it's a conspiracy. There's no way they could have carried it out. Let me ask you, how difficult would it have been to carry out if you had this, if you really had this situation? If you were told every single time that there were people that lived in the area before you, and you might be surprised how often this story is repeated, because it's always a story of, well, we're not actually the first settlers. We're not the very first ones. We're the secondary settlers, or we're the tertiary settlers. We came in after the first or the second group. There were people here before us, if you remember our account of Dyersville in Iowa. And so how would anybody be able to verify or determine anything? And remember, this was at a time where we're told that the only way that people recorded what was going on was in their personal diaries or their journals. And yet, oddly enough, what's the chain of custody behind personal diaries and journals? Well, 9 times out of 10, the ones that are remembered are the ones that are, of course, collected by the institutions. Now, am I saying that there aren't any journals out there that have not been collected by institutions? No. But are you really going to find any sort of allusion or indication for what was happening here? If this just all happened as a natural process and everybody was all enthralled about how they were building libraries where there were no libraries, or how they were establishing libraries where there were no libraries, and suddenly you brought in this population afterwards, well, the library was always here. That's how things were. Yes, the Carnegie grant, that's how we built this library, this beautiful library. Now, did anybody actually see this? Well, no, they didn't see it because those settlers relocated to other areas for better opportunities. What happened to them? I don't know. We don't keep records on them. This is the United States. It's freedom of movement. At least at that time it was. So I know it may seem a little far-fetched and there may be other explanations for it, but when you look where the Carnegie grants were really concentrated at, oddly enough, it corresponds with some of the most unique and direct Old World evidence that we have. It also corresponds with where we have rumors of older libraries that once existed that were either destroyed by fire or that the books were reconsolidated at, you'll never guess it, a Carnegie library. So that's the big mind bender for you right there. What are your thoughts on this exploration? And again, I'm not coming to any final conclusions. I'm just saying there seems to be quite the trail that gives an indication that there was a very deliberate plan, and that was the real purpose behind these Carnegie libraries. So you have the asylums, you have the repurposed reset compounds. That's where you send members of the population who are, how shall we say, uncooperative, or somebody who wants to say, yes, I remember that they built a library in Tama County. I remember that they built one in Toledo and Tama, the twin towns. And I remember how they consolidated all the books. Ah, yes, well, you're heading down to Mount Pleasant Mental Asylum down in southeastern Iowa. You're going to spend the rest of your life there because you're just a nonconformist, and your wife doesn't really like you. So we're going to send you down there. Actually, we might send her down there too because the town doesn't like her. Oh, and if you think about it and you realize that there's also many asylums that we haven't even mentioned, do you know how many asylums there are off the Kirkbride list? Suddenly, this isn't such a grand conspiracy after all. Suddenly, this becomes something that is very attainable and something that somebody could have done while at the same time controlling the flow of information. It's a lot easier than we like to think. Well, what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments, and I hope you enjoyed this exploration. Thank you for joining me.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
We'll begin by looking at the estate timeline of the Biltmore. What was George Washington Vanderbilt's original vision for Biltmore? How did that vision evolve through the years? How does his legacy live on today? And our source here is from the Biltmore site itself. 1862, second year of the United States Civil War, George Washington Vanderbilt, what a name, is born on Staten Island. As a grandson of famed shipping entrepreneur and industrialist Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt, George Vanderbilt takes his place among one of America's wealthiest and best-known families. And you might recall we came across Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt, it's the Commodore, not the Admiral, when he ran afoul of William Walker, our famed filibuster who was from Tennessee, who attempted to assert American control, according to the official account, over Mexico and then furthermore Central America, until he was defeated by an intervening army from Costa Rica of all places. In any event, moving on, 1888, George Vanderbilt visits Asheville, North Carolina for the first time, and I'm quite certain he found it a very beautiful and alluring place, much as any of the rest of us did when we came across the beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It captivated George Vanderbilt, and he considers the area as a location for his new country home. I mean, who wouldn't? Shortly after, he begins purchasing land for what will become Biltmore. He hires Richard Morris Hunt to design and build the home, and Frederick Law Olmsted to design the gardens and grounds. 1889, construction of Biltmore House begins. George Vanderbilt's 250-room French Renaissance chateau is a true marvel. Oh, so we're calling this a French Renaissance chateau, the largest undertaking in residential architecture in the nation, possibly the entire land. Over a 6-year period, an entire community of craftsmen, yes, those infinite numbers of craftsmen that we had available at the end of the 19th century, come together to create America's premier home and the remarkable gardens and grounds that surround it. Look at that picture right there. See, we've got scaffolding, so that's a very legitimate construction photo. I'm convinced. 1895, George Vanderbilt officially opens Biltmore to family and friends. On Christmas Eve, of course, what a great time. The country retreat George Vanderbilt has spent so long planning is marvelously decorated and full of festivity. because apparently that didn't take very long either. Infinite craftsmen and people who work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and no safety standards. Not to mention no internet distractions. Anything could be done. Interesting image there. The finished home contains more than 4 acres of floor space, including 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, so more bathrooms than bedrooms, by 8, so you've got communal bathrooms too, and 65 fireplaces. Why not 165 fireplaces? 1898, George Vanderbilt marries Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in Paris. Edith is a descendant of Peter Stuyvesant, or Stuyvesant, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the first governor of Dutch colonial New York. After honeymooning in Italy, George and Edith returned to live at Biltmore. And by all means, please correct my pronunciation if it's off on this one. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt is born at Biltmore. George and Edith's only child is born on the evening of August 22nd in Louis 15 room in Biltmore House. Oh, so was there a Louis 1 through 14 room as well? I'm just being facetious, but why not? It is a celebrity birth, even by modern standards. Oh, isn't that intriguing? So did they put it out in the papers and broadcast it on the radio and then pushed it out on the internet since Nikola Tesla had invented the wireless internet by 1900? Oh well, no matter. 1900, construction of the main dairy and horse barn begins. You'd think they would have had that constructed right after the house. The horse barn is a thriving social and work center for the families who farm Biltmore and the agricultural heart of the estate. It remains a unique connection to the estate's past. 1914, George Vanderbilt passes away at the age of 51. Wasn't that old. George Vanderbilt is buried in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum on Staten Island. Why not build a new mausoleum on the Biltmore estate? I mean, you're out there in the mountains where it's very pretty. Why wouldn't you just build a new mausoleum? Well, I guess, the Vanderbilt family had to be in their mausoleum. He leaves a legacy of philanthropy, not oligarchy, which Edith continues, selling approximately 87,000 acres of the estate to the United States Forest Service for less than $5 an acre. Philanthropist, but, still less than $5 an acre. We're not giving it away for free. You don't give anything away for free. This includes the cradle of forestry as one of the first national forests east of the Mississippi River. Intriguing. 1924, Cornelia Vanderbilt marries the Honorable John Francis Amherst Cecil. 4 names. Maybe if he had 27 names, he'd be even more important. Look at that wedding photo. Quite intriguing. The Cecils are wed at All Souls Church in Biltmore Village, with Edith Vanderbilt escorting her daughter. What else have we got? 1925, George Vanderbilt's first grandson is born. Again, in the Louis 15 room. Not one of the other ones. 1928, the Cecils welcome their second son. 1930, Cornelia and John Cecil open Biltmore House to the public. So, right at the start of the Great Depression. The Cecils respond to requests to increase area tourism during the Depression and to generate income to preserve the estate. Alright, so it's the Depression. Who exactly has the money to engage in tourism? And who's actually going to be paying to go see the Biltmore House? Hey, dear, yeah, I know I just lost my job and I have no work prospects, but why don't we head on down to Asheville and go see the Biltmore? I know, we'll empty out the savings because our gold hasn't been seized yet, and I'll sell that, and then we can go to the Biltmore estate. Sounds like a grand old time. 1942, Biltmore House stores art during World War II. During the war, the house stores priceless works from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And why is that? Was there some kind of grand concern that the National Gallery of Art was going to be attacked or sabotaged in some way, shape, or form during World War II? At any point, was there any sort of existential threat to the United States? I mean, unless we're to believe that a U-boat was going to surface there in the Potomac and try to blast the National Gallery of Art with its deck gun. I don't think it'd have the range. Maybe the Japanese could have attacked with their little Zeppelins that they tried, if you ever read about that, riding on the wonderful jet streams. 1960, William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil returns to Biltmore. Leaving his banking career in New York, William joins his brother George in managing the estate, focusing on self-sufficiency and preserving the estate's historic splendor. Isn't that funny? It kind of reads like the plot of the Dallas revival, the TV series in the early 2000 or the early 2010s. Where's JR when you need him? 1963, Biltmore is officially nominated as a National Historic Landmark. Really, that late? Why didn't they just instantly declare it a National Historic Landmark? It's only one of the largest estates in the world, but, we'll get around to it when we get around to it. The original landmark designation was based on the theme conservation of natural resources. Isn't that rich? 1971, William Cecil plants his first grapevines just below Biltmore House and invited a guy by the name of Jean-Luc Picard to come work it. The inaugural wine vintage is bottled in the conservatory basement. Less than pleased with this first bottling, William Cecil travels to France, see, Jean-Luc Picard, and brings back sixth-generation winemaster, Philippe Jourdain, to be Biltmore's first winemaker. Oh, sorry, Jean-Luc. This goes on. 1983, the Biltmore Estate Wine Company is established. Because why not? We'll have a wine company here. Construction begins on a new state-of-the-art winery in what had been the estate's dairy barn. Mr. Cecil's son, William Bill A.V. Cecil Jr., assumes leadership of the renovation. Looks like he's having a grand old time there. Yeah, we're just doing a nice little renovation here. Hey, this is fun. I love every day. 1985, winery opens to the public. And he's named president and CEO of the Biltmore Company. Oh, so now it's a Biltmore Company. Over 100 years after his grandfather, George Vanderbilt, opened Biltmore House to family and friends, Mr. Cecil retires. His son assumes leadership of the company. Oh boy, is there really anything else to go on about this? Oh, then we have the Inn, which opened in 2001. So you can go stay there. And naturally, if you need the true certification that the Biltmore Estate is an old world building, remember, it is a popular wedding venue. Market Gardener's Cottage, 2005. Biltmore Estate opens to overnight guests. Why not? Antler Hill Village opens, so we've got our own little village there, a winery. Biltmore is honored for environmental stewardship in 2012, of course. And then the Village Hotel opens in 2015. And William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil passes away at the age of 89 in 2017. Looks like a comfortable picture. 2017, Diana Deanie Cecil Pickering is named chair of the board. She's the daughter of William Vanderbilt Amherst Cecil and sister to CEO and President Bill Cecil. So not the Vanderbilts, but the Cecils now, it would seem. Sharon Fenchak becomes head winemaker and vice president. Sounds like a fun job. So a lot of history with this Biltmore estate, and that brings us to today. So let's take a look at the floor plans. Now let's take a look at the floor plans that we have available from the Biltmore estate from our friend Richard Morris Hunt, another architect extraordinaire. We'll take a brief look at him, and yes, I'll be looking at the Wikipedia on him. But looking at the sub-basement isn't interesting. It's the sub-basement, as they call it, the lowest floor. We have the plant storage room. We have several boiler rooms, boiler and coal rooms, storage rooms. And one of the most notable aspects about the Biltmore is that it is a self-sufficient, quote-unquote, estate. It reminds us of many of the so-called asylums and vast hospital complexes that we've looked at in other explorations, where we see that they have the capability to be self-sufficient with their own power and quite a layout. And indeed, when we look at some of the photos and the on-site footage, we'll see that there is some impressive construction that went into the foundation of this building. But we'll look at the construction photos in a moment. And in the basement, we have a kitchen in the courtyard, servants' dining room, servants' pantry, open to plant storage room below. Very intriguing. Numerous corridors, folding rooms, other corridors. Oh, and then there's a gymnasium and a lounging room, apparently. And this is where the great swimming pool is. That's an interesting thing to look at. And you've got your bowling alley, because, it just wouldn't be a place unless there was a bowling alley. The Halloween room. Is this the room where they practiced Halloween every day of the year, 365 days a year? Not really sure. Going up to the main floor, here we have the winter garden, the banquet hall, the billiard room, the breakfast room, the corridor, the balcony, music room. Very interesting. Butler's pantry. So many corridors, bachelor's wing hall, vestibule, and numerous vestibules, a carriage porch, an office. So many different rooms with so many stated purposes. Oh, here is the library, and then the den off the library. So you could go to the library, get a book, and then chill out in the den. Very intriguing. And breakfast room, and the music room. I think that's what all of our houses are missing, or our apartments. We all need a breakfast room and a music room. Let's go to the upper 3 floors. And we'll start with the second floor. And here we can see the top on the garden. Second floor living hall. There is the Louis XV room. Oh, I'm a little disappointed. I was expecting to see every other Louis room. Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. That's the Louis 16 room. There's the Louis 15 room. Interesting. So, no Louis 1 through 14, but we do have a Louis 15 and a Louis 16 room. Yes, I know. When you look at enough Roman numerals, they all start to look at the same. Very intriguing numbering system, isn't it? We have the staircase hall. We have Old English. Chippendale. Yeah, that's what it's called. Sheraton? Do we have the Holiday Inn Express room as well? Very interesting with all these different rooms and all their naming conventions. Mr. Vanderbilt's chamber. Mrs. Vanderbilt's chamber. Mrs. Vanderbilt gets a little bit of an oval chamber, and Mr. Vanderbilt has a different shaped chamber. And the oak sitting room. So they each have their chambers, and then they could meet in the oak sitting room. I mean, just so much space, you don't even know what to do with it. Chamber, chamber, chamber. Outside balcony. Open to banquet hall below. Yes, so much space and so many plans. Let's go to the third floor. Third floor living hall. Everybody has to have their own living hall. South Tower room. North Tower room. How come they don't have elaborate names? Oh well, doesn't matter. The Van Dyke room. Yeah, not going to go anywhere with that one. Watson room. The Madonna room. Was there some figure of the Madonna in the Madonna room? Very intriguing. All these named rooms, and we're only on the third floor. Chamber, numerous chambers, as in, we don't know what to call it room. We'll just call it the room of rooms, room 1, room 2. Just number it. We've run out of ideas. Fourth floor. Observatory. Servant. So all the servants got put up on the fourth floor. Very intriguing. But, they provided them an observatory and a nice little staircase. So what do you think of these plans? Would you like to have a structure laid out like this? And what other purposes do we think that this structure originally served in its original intention? Well, let me know what you think in the comments. Now let's take a look at some of the collections that you'll find in the Biltmore estate. So let's take a look at some of the collection highlights of the Biltmore, and much like many other wondrous Gilded Age mansions or impressive compounds or complexes or whatever we want to call them, the Biltmore consists of more than 92,000 items, from architectural drawings of the house to works by Monet and more. A limited selection is highlighted below, including one of its oldest pieces and its newest addition. Italian Renaissance wellhead, circa 1500. Maker unknown. I'm surprised it's not referenced to some sort of Renaissance wonder. Location, East Terrace of Biltmore House, and we can see that it's quite an impressive wellhead. Looks like we've got the old lion and some figures in it. Made of Rosa de Verona marble, this fountainhead was likely originally used to decorate and protect an active well in Venice during the Italian Renaissance. Likely. A likely story. It has become known as the Hunt Fountain, as it is depicted in the John Singer Sargent portrait of Biltmore House architect Richard Morris Hunt. Well, why not? I mean, he was the super architect who did it all. Triumph of Faith, circa 1530. Maker unknown. Belgian. Never mind, forget it. Tapestry Gallery of Biltmore House. Part of the triumph of the Seven Virtues series, this tapestry is centrally woven with the personification of faith as the female figure on the chariot holding a church, the cross, and a chalice. Above her are members of the Trinity. Very interesting. And is that indeed what it's showing, or is that what they're telling us it's showing? That's always the interesting thing when you associate dates and stories with items, but is that really what's associated with them? That's something that we always need to question. Chinese fishbowl, speaking of questioning things, circa 1573 to 1620. Very exact range there. Again, unknown maker, but it's Chinese. Library of the Biltmore House. Glazed porcelain fishbowl, decorated with the imperial 5-claw dragon. There's the 5 claws. Is from the Wanli period of the Ming Dynasty. While there are 3 Chinese fish bowls in the Biltmore collection, this one is the smallest, the most colorful, and likely the rarest. What is that word again? We get a lot of likelies and probables. When did something become a something or whatever, says Captain Picard. Very interesting. Ebony cabinet on stand, circa 1650. So, again, now we have a much more precise date. Maker, possibly Jean Mace or Pierre Gaulle? French. Location, oak sitting room of Biltmore House. This elaborate furnishing, and yes, it is very elaborate. Let's take a look at this without reading the description that we have on it. Looks like we got some nice vases on top of it. Very intricate patterns, though. And I always wonder on the origin of these particular items. Let's take a little closer look, because naturally we have limited access to these images. Very intriguing symbols that are depicted on this, and it's very intricate as well. Not sure exactly what to make of it. What are your thoughts on this ebony cabinet on stand, circa 1650, made by one of two French individuals? Oh, it also features a painting of Juno and Jupiter. The Chariot of Aurora, circa 1720. And here we actually have an individual identified, Giovanni Pellegrini, Italian. Library of the Biltmore House. So, wonderful works of art in that library. Richard Morris Hunt designed the library to accommodate the ceiling painting. I want a ceiling painting in there, Mr. Hunt. Please design the house to accommodate it, which George Vanderbilt purchased from dealer Joseph Spiridon under Hunt's advisement. Okay, wait a minute. So Hunt said, why don't you purchase this, and then you'll direct me to accommodate this painting that I told you to purchase. I'll tell you what, these stories become more convoluted. I mean, these official historical accounts become more convoluted the more you read them. Yes, I'm saying that. Originally located in the ballroom in Venice, in the Pisani-Palace. 13 separate canvases and measures about 64 feet long by 32 feet wide. Now, here's the thing I always wondered in all these accounts that we have of this artwork from Europe that ended up in all these Gilded Age mansions across the United States. How was it the European nations just stood idly by and allowed this to happen? Oh, I know. Money. Money speaks everything, doesn't it? Now, do we really think that they would allow that to happen today? Let's just say we have some, we'll call him a philanthropist. An American philanthropist who wants to purchase all these wonderful European cultural artistic treasures. Are they really just going to stand by and let that happen? If the price is right? Never mind. Louis XV mantle clock, circa 1760. And here we have the makers designated and then some possiblies. And it's in Mrs. Vanderbilt's bedroom in Biltmore House. Oh, did Mrs. Vanderbilt have her own bedroom too? An intriguing account, isn't it? Kind of reads like the account that we have of the Hearst Castle over in California. One of many clocks in the Biltmore collection. Yes, that is quite an elaborately embellished piece. And it looks like we've got the 4 eyes for 4 there. The Louis XV style is characterized by curved shapes, a lightness or playfulness of design, and liberal use of gold, among other things. Very intriguing. What else do we have? Oh, the overmantel. Again, a 50-year period, circa 1700 to 1750. And an unknown maker. Swiss. Unknown, but we know it's Swiss. Tyrolean chimney room in Biltmore House. Serving as the focal point of the Tyrolean chimney room, this unique overmantel is an example of the incorporation of antique items into the design of the Biltmore House. So once again, we just have this vast amalgamation, this collection of all these very intricate and wondrous art pieces that all came from Europe, whether it was Switzerland, France, Italy, and again, no issues over in Europe because, the price is right. And look, it's George Vanderbilt. You just can't say no to him any more than you could say no to William Randolph Hearst in the 1920s. Look, they need artwork to adorn their places with. Very interesting. Netsuke? Unknown? Japanese? Are we sure? Quite an interesting little critter, isn't it? This is one of many Netsuke that George Vanderbilt collected during his 1892 trip to Japan. George Vanderbilt got around. Originally created as toggles to secure a storage bag to a kimono sash, Netsuke became highly treasured by Western collectors in the 19th century. Netsuke are exceptionally tactile objects and miniature sculptural masterworks. Yeah, I would say so. Is a mugwai a miniature sculptural masterwork? Never mind. Moving on. Ooh, I like this. Game table and chess set, circa 1820. Makers unknown. Biltmore Legacy. This Empire game table and its natural and red-stained ivory chess set were owned by Napoleon Bonaparte during his exile on St. Helena. Hey, did we get to see our good favorite actor there toying around with these things? Joaquin Phoenix, you're going to play with that chess set, but you're going to be thinking of Josephina. because that's what Napoleon did while he was playing chess. The movie showed it, and it was very clear. It's unclear how James McHenry acquired the table and chess set, but in 1883, he gifted them to George Vanderbilt for his 21st birthday. Oh, goodness. Hey, Josephine. Hey, Josephina. I'm thinking about you. Yes, I'm toying around with the name, okay? It's just very intriguing. The chess set that Napoleon had in his exile on St. Helena somehow ended up with George Vanderbilt. Is there any way to verify or, maybe do Pawn Stars in the 19th century? Okay, never mind. Roger and Angelique on Hippogriff, circa 1840 to 1900. Again, a vast array of time. And we're saying this is French. Location is in the Tapestry Gallery in the Biltmore House. Very interesting sculpture, though. Yes, I've never seen a horse with hooves like that, but yes, I know it's a mythological figure, or at least a representation of one. Really has you wondering what's going on here, and is there something else being depicted? That's what's always intriguing looking at these old works of art. Oh, and I haven't mentioned it yet, but yes, we have our old favorite symbol that's depicted on every single piece. Nothing odd about that. And I think we'll stop with this one here. The Triumphal Arch of Maximilian, a 30-year period, 1849 to 1879. Albrecht Dürer, German. Well, so now we got the Germans involved here. Music Room of Biltmore House. This woodcut commissioned by Emperor Maximilian I to distribute as propaganda. Propaganda, what's that? Oh, I know. That's something that was done in the past by rulers and sovereigns of nations to have people think their particular way. We don't have propaganda in the 21st century. We have information, good information and bad information. It was created with 192 separate blocks. Though the original was made around 1515, this version was printed in the second half of the 19th century. And George Vanderbilt just happened to be an avid collector of the prints, and so naturally he procured it. Quite impressive, and very intricate as well. Someone should have a triumphal arch like this built. I'm kind of surprised that George Vanderbilt, or any one of the Vanderbilts for that matter, didn't have a triumphal arch like this built. I mean, they achieved the greatest triumphs just in building this. Oh, the desk set. Okay, I know I said I was going to stop, but I'll just look at this desk set here, because here we have another Louis XV style desk set, also known as the Encrier, is made of ormolu and tortoise shell. Very elaborate. And I certainly agree with the description on that. And some very intriguing figures in this. So what do you think these selected pieces are showing us? And what does this tell us about the Vanderbilts? And why is it all of these individuals of importance, whether we call them robber barons, philanthropists, oligarchs, or just simply self-made individuals of tremendous esteem and ability from the 19th century? How did they happen to end up with all this art? And how could there be this much art to go around? And again, was the price just right and nobody in Europe wanted to resist all these upstart Americans acquiring all this? What are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comments. So let's take a look at the construction photos that we have of the Biltmore estate. Very intriguing here. It looks like we have a makeshift railway that ran right up to the estate. Well, that's very sensible, and it certainly sorts out a number of logistical issues, and given how easily they could construct and throw up railroads anywhere that they wanted to, and apparently build locomotives because they had so many they were crashing them during that time frame, and then a couple years later. So we're informed that the Biltmore is constructed solely out of bricks and that lovely Indiana limestone, which there seemed to be an infinite amount of. And yet what appears to be limestone bricks. And again, in the images here, we have a lot of people standing around, although it looks like some people are working here. Many cranes, and I'd like to know exactly how they excavated this out, because this is 1889, early 1890s. Whenever this photo was actually taken. How exactly did they dig all this out? Because they didn't really have heavy machinery available yet. You can see the cranes that they're supposedly using. And once again, these images seem to create more questions than they actually answer, and certainly we can question the veracity of them, but for the purposes of this exploration, we're going to take these images at face value, because it's even more interesting when we accept the account as it is, such as this picture we have of these individuals here by the construction with all their nice and fancy hats. And yes, these individuals don't look remotely ominous in any way, shape, or form. Just looks like a collection of well-meaning individuals, gentlemen primarily, who are just hanging out for the evening. He looks awfully familiar. Where have we seen that face before? I'm not exactly sure. Looking at some of these other images, though, we can see an elaborate complex that seems to have been constructed to complete the construction of the Biltmore estate. Now, what you would expect to see, especially in something that is very well documented, like I'll give this to the Eiffel Tower, at least they have images that are supposedly in chronological order. Although, things become a little bit more problematic when it comes down to trying to decipher the chronological order of the Biltmore estate images that we have of the construction. And again, we see a lot of the scaffolding and rudimentary cranes that were available. And I was kind of hoping to see a hamster wheel crane. Another image where we have individuals simply standing around and looking really cool as they do the construction. Well, we know why they had to stand around, it was so because of the limitations of the photographic technology and the cameras at the time. If they were moving, it would be very blurry, except for when they were doing the Grand Pass and Review in Washington, D.C. after the Civil War. So very interesting, and I would expect to see more images showing potentially all the brickwork, because like I said, what we're told is that the Biltmore estate, the inner walls are constructed of brick. Granted, this is what we're told. I don't know. I can't verify this because the place is already built, and these images aren't really answering this question, but brick surrounded by that ever omnipresent Indiana limestone, of which there seems to have been an infinite amount of, because this isn't the only structure that they use that wondrous Indiana limestone in. So, very impressive, and yet another conflicting account. And here we can see in this other construction photo, it looks like the structure is already completed, and they're either doing some renovation or remodeling. Now, I'm oftentimes lamenting the absence of interior construction photos, although it does seem to give us the indication that there is some interior construction photos, but again, look at this particular photo. What exactly is going on here? Now, we do actually see some brickwork, but there are many, how shall we say, unique questions that one could ask if they do additional analysis on this photo. Perhaps that's brickwork going on. Very intriguing background on this particular image, where we see some of the layout of the main structure and facade of the Biltmore house. But I think where we'll really find a lot of questions answered is when we actually do our on-site, because seeing something for real is always the best way to assess and analyze it. But looking at these images, we can see supposedly that this is some of the interior construction that was occurring. And oddly enough, it almost looks like we have bricks that are suspended in midair, or at least on top of the X-beams there. Hard to really say what's going on just looking at the images. And of course here we're supposed to be seeing the limestones that are all piled up, and then construction of the structure on top of it. So many fascinating and conflicting images that we have that seem to portray many different questions that we would have concerning the construction of the Biltmore estate. And you might recall in our earlier exploration where we looked at the Biltmore estate, we saw that the family was with travel and acquiring all the wondrous artwork and the art collection that we just looked at, that they had to use to fill this very impressive edifice, this compound, this complex. And indeed, even to this day, we still have an entire village and everything else that's associated with it. So I don't know, it's very hard to tell exactly what to make of these images of the construction of the Biltmore estate. It seems to be very similar to other alleged images we have. So let's go on site to take a look at the Biltmore estate, and as we look around we can get an idea for this very impressive Indiana limestone, which again there seems to be no shortage of, especially at the end of the 19th century, to construct such an elaborate edifice. And we can see that there is no detail spared on the construction of the Biltmore, with some of the impressive images that we see in the decorations above each of the windows, which naturally won't become very clear in the construction photos. Sometimes when you're actually on site and you try to reconcile that with what you just saw in the old construction photos or some of the older photos, it almost becomes difficult to really believe that what you were actually looking at reflects what you're looking at now with your own eyes, because you can really verify what the structures are made of. And here we see many of the chimneys, and we can see the vast estate and how much space there really was on it. Of course, laid out by Frederick Olmsted, our good friend who achieved miracles for the Chicago World's Fair. Some of the details that you can see, though, within the particular Biltmore is that each of the balconies has decorative detail, and the towers do as well. And of course, there are the many chimneys. Now, I think it'd be fascinating if there were actually construction photos available of some of that. In the interior, though, you can see that it is very well decorated and adorned, and here we are in the billiards room with many pictures in it, and we can get a good idea of just how well decorated this place actually is, and seeing this massive fireplace. Now, again, this is some other construction photos that were lacking, was the construction of the fireplace and the interior. And again, I don't see that just a couple photos that hint at some of the interior features being completed, such as this column. And, of course, we never see construction photos of columns, and I can't imagine why. Nice organ. It's exactly what you need in your tremendous Vanderbilt mansion, is an organ. And, of course, you need every single doorway very well decorated and very well adorned to the top of every pillar. And every single bit of material that you can examine within this impressive edifice is real and genuine. And even this reminds me of some of the wonders that I've seen in the Midwest palaces or the state capitals, to include a very well decorated ceiling, because of course you need to have a very well decorated ceiling. Everything from the floors to the walls to the ceiling, once again, and it's no exception here in the Biltmore estate. And here we can see some of the elaborate pieces in the vast array of collections that we have. All the wondrous artwork and pieces from around the land, all consolidated in this one single location that just happens to be the largest house in the United States ever constructed. And here again, you can get an idea for something that doesn't really hint of limestone, but almost seems like some sort of advanced concrete or geopolymer. And again, you can see the extent of the estate all the way out to the mountains. And there's no doubt that this is a very pretty land, and there are all kinds of areas here where you could expect someone to want to build their estate out in the middle of nowhere. But I suppose I'm just having difficulty reconciling the story of construction that we're given with what we're actually seeing in this on-site exploration. And once again, we have another one of the fireplaces that of course has columns around it. And again, infinite tapestries and decorations as far as the eye can see. And yes, of course, a very subtle bedroom that we would expect to see. Now, one of the things that I've seen many people ask about in the comments or express concern about is how exactly would someone, even with the wealth of the Vanderbilts, want to live in an edifice like this that would require this kind of cleaning? And that's certainly a great question. I'm also very intrigued by the fact that many of these very large edifices that we have, these mansions, these castles, these vast estates, whatever you want to call them, they have many odd similarities with some of the large asylums and hospitals that we've looked at across the land. And the similarity being that this is an entire compound that you could house many people. Well, the explanation here is that they needed to have servants' quarters, and of course you needed to have a veritable army to keep this place clean and facilitated. And it's just because people who were very wealthy back at the start of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, had this to do with their wealth, and yet we still consider them philanthropists to this day. Look at this impressive staircase and some of the detail that you see with this. And this is just something that completely baffled me when I saw this in person, because you can see ornate details on the interior of this stairway. And now going down to the basement. And here again, this is not simple brickwork, but this gives you the impression of stones that have been arranged together in this impressive edifice. And certainly not that limestone, but stones that have been painstakingly placed together. Now, you do get the sign of bricks in some locations. But was this really constructed from 1889 to 1895 as we're told? Certainly somebody constructed it. Somebody put the effort to do this. But are we to really believe that it was this army of contractors and artisans who descended upon this isolated location, especially at the time frame, and even constructed this very wondrous pool? Now, what could the original intention have been for this pool? And look at how well arrayed this vault is, if you will, or this chamber that this pool's in. This doesn't exactly reflect what I'd expect of a pool, though. I'll say this for Hearst Castle, its pools seem like they were intended to be pools, but what was the original intention there? Again, looking at the exterior, you can see all the very impressive architecture and all the impressive detailing that went into finishing off the Biltmore estate. And you can see that calling this place a castle, a compound, yes, we have our lions again, is simply underselling it. And here's a still of the fireplace where you can see all the detail that went into it. Now, how much time would that have originally taken when they really did it? Now, supposedly, this is one of the most well-documented, as we love saying those words, constructed estates. And yet, even looking at this supposed documentation, we still have the same questions that we always have when we look at these elaborate construction photos. And I think that the Biltmore estate, when they're going to this kind of effort to show and tell us that, yes, this was an edifice that was constructed during what we consider the Fifth Era, or our contemporary civilization, you almost get the impression that they seem to be attempting a little much to try to give us that impression. Yes, we built a train out there. Yes, we had innovation in technology. It was the 19th century. Anything was possible. There were no logistical limitations. We can move the gauge on a rail track in 36 hours for 11,000 miles of track. So, naturally, building something like the Biltmore estate would be simple and easy. A little something I have for you to close out. Why don't you check and see how long it takes to build comparable modern estates, and see how it compares to the completion of the Biltmore estate. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.